The day my granddaughter asked why nobody liked me was the day I realized my trial had already happened without me. My name is Patricia Bennett. I was 70 years old when I learned that an entire branch of my family believed a version of me that did not exist. The strange part was that nobody told me directly. Nobody sat me down. Nobody accused me of anything. Instead, they smiled at family dinners, exchanged polite greetings, and slowly treated me like a problem they wished would disappear. It happened during my granddaughter Lily's 12th birthday party. The celebration was held at my son Eric's house, a large suburban home about 20 minutes from where I lived. I arrived carrying a wrapped gift and a homemade chocolate cake. Baking had always been my way of showing love. My late husband George used to joke that every important family memory involved one of my cakes somewhere in the background. I smiled thinking about him as I walked up the driveway. For a few moments, everything felt normal. Children ran through the backyard. Balloons floated above picnic tables. Music played softly from outdoor speakers. Then Lily walked over and hugged me. "Grandma, I'm glad you came," she said. "Mom almost didn't invite you." I laughed awkwardly, assuming she was joking. "Why would your mother do that?" Lily shrugged. "She says you always ruin everything." The words landed harder than I expected. Children rarely invent opinions like that. They repeat what they hear. I forced a smile and handed her the gift. "Well, I hope your birthday is wonderful." She ran off toward her friends without realizing what she had just done. I stood there holding the cake box, feeling as though the ground had shifted beneath me. Throughout the afternoon, I noticed things I had ignored before. Conversations stopped when I approached. Certain relatives seemed unusually distant. A few people offered polite smiles that never reached their eyes. One of my cousins greeted everyone warmly except me. Another relative excused herself the moment I joined a conversation. For years, I had blamed these moments on coincidence. That afternoon, for the first time, I started wondering whether they were connected. Later, while everyone gathered near the patio, I overheard my daughter-in-law Monica speaking with two relatives. She did not know I was standing nearby. "Patricia always finds a way to make things about herself," she said with a sigh. "We spend half our lives cleaning up after her drama." The women nodded sympathetically. One even patted Monica's shoulder. I felt a sharp ache in my chest. Not because strangers believed her, because family did. These were people who had known me for decades. People who attended my wedding. People who celebrated holidays in my home. Yet somehow, Monica's version of me had become more believable than the real thing. I quietly stepped away before anyone noticed me. That evening, after the party ended, I sat alone in my kitchen staring at a framed photograph of George. The house felt unusually quiet. I kept hearing Lily's voice in my head. "Mom says you always ruin everything." Somewhere along the way, a story had been written about me. A story I had never read. A story everyone else seemed to know by heart. And for the first time, I found myself asking a question I could not ignore. Who had been telling it? That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Lily's innocent voice repeating the same sentence. "Mom says you always ruin everything." Children do not invent stories like that. They inherit them. They absorb them from conversations, from comments spoken carelessly in kitchens and living rooms, from opinions repeated often enough to sound like facts. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep and walked downstairs. The house felt larger since George passed away 3 years earlier. Some nights the silence comforted me. Other nights it felt like an empty room inside my chest. I made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table where George and I had shared thousands of conversations over 4 decades of marriage. The photograph beside the refrigerator caught my attention again. It showed all of us at a family reunion 8 years earlier. Everyone was smiling. Monica stood beside Eric with her arm around his waist. Lily was still small enough to sit on my lap. Looking at that picture, I found myself wondering when things changed. Or perhaps the more honest question was whether they had changed at all. The next morning, I attended church as usual. For years, Sunday mornings had been one of the few constants in my life. Familiar faces, familiar hymns, familiar routines. Yet even there, something felt different now. Several people greeted me politely, but I noticed hesitation in their eyes. Not hostility. Something worse. Sympathy. The kind of sympathy people offer when they think someone has caused their own problems. After the service, a woman I had known for nearly 20 years approached me near the parking lot. We exchanged pleasantries before she awkwardly asked whether things were getting better between me and Eric's family. The question immediately caught my attention. What do you mean? I asked. She looked surprised. Oh, I just assumed. Her voice trailed off. Assumed what? For a moment, she seemed unsure whether to continue. Then she shook her head and smiled weakly. Never mind. It is none of my business. But it was my business. Because somehow people were forming opinions about my relationship with my family without ever speaking to me. Later that week, I met an old friend for lunch. Nancy and I had known each other for more than 30 years. She was one of the few people who never seemed interested in gossip. Halfway through the meal, she placed her fork down and looked at me carefully. Patricia, she said gently, can I ask you something? I nodded. Have you really been refusing to help Eric and Monica? The question hit me like a cold wind. Refusing to help them with what? Nancy blinked. They told people you have been making things difficult for years. Financially, emotionally, everything. I stared at her. For several seconds, I could not speak. Then memories started lining up in my mind. The distant relatives, the awkward conversations, the sympathy, the avoidance. Suddenly, the pieces fit together. Somewhere, someone had been telling a story about me. Not recently. For a long time. Nancy immediately realized something was wrong. Patricia, she said quietly, you did not know? I shook my head. She looked, genuinely troubled. Then there is something you need to hear. For a long moment, I simply stared at Nancy across the table. The restaurant around us faded into background noise. Dishes clattered. Waiters moved between tables. People laughed and carried on conversations. Yet all I could hear was the question she had asked. Have you really been refusing to help Eric and Monica? It sounded absurd, almost unbelievable, and yet suddenly so many things made sense. Nancy reached across the table and gently touched my hand. Patricia, I thought you knew. I slowly shook my head. Know what? Nancy hesitated before speaking. Monica has been telling people for years that you make everything difficult. I felt a strange heaviness settle in my chest. What exactly has she been saying? Nancy looked uncomfortable. Different things to different people. That you criticize her parenting. That you guilt Eric whenever he spends time with his family. That you refuse to help unless you get attention in return. Each sentence felt like a stone being added to a pile. Not because strangers believe those things. Because family members apparently did. I thought about birthday parties where invitations arrived late. Holiday gatherings where nobody asked my opinion. Family photographs I somehow never received copies of. For years, I blamed distance, busy schedules, and changing priorities. Now I wondered if something else had been happening the entire time. Nancy continued. Most people believed her because Eric never corrected the story. That sentence hurt more than all the others. Monica was my daughter-in-law. Eric was my son. If anyone knew the truth, it should have been him. Yet according to Nancy, he had remained silent while people formed opinions about me. After lunch ended, I drove home in silence. The road felt longer than usual. Every red light gave me another opportunity to revisit old memories. The more I thought about them, the more details resurfaced. 3 years earlier, a cousin stopped calling after a family reunion. An aunt who once visited regularly suddenly became distant. Even church friends occasionally spoke to me with an odd mixture of politeness and caution. At the time, I never questioned it. Now I was questioning everything. When I arrived home, I went straight to the den and opened an old photo album. Family vacations, Christmas mornings, birthday celebrations. Looking through the pages felt different now. Not because the memories had changed, because my understanding of them had. Then I noticed something strange. In photograph after photograph from the past several years, Monica stood at the center of every gathering. Not physically, socially. She was always the organizer, the messenger, the person explaining situations, the person speaking for everyone else. I remembered how often relatives said things like, Monica told us you were busy, or Monica said you preferred staying home. At the time, I never questioned those comments. Why would I? She was family. That evening, my phone rang. It was Eric. His voice sounded cheerful, relaxed, completely unaware of the storm building inside my mind. He called to ask whether I enjoyed Lily's birthday party. I answered politely. Then I asked a simple question. Eric, do people think I dislike your family? The silence that followed lasted only a second, but it was enough. Mom, where is this coming from? He asked. No. Not of course not. Just where is this coming from? My stomach tightened. We spoke for another few minutes before ending the call. Afterward, I sat alone in my living room staring at George's photograph. For the first time, I no longer wondered whether someone had been telling stories about me. I knew they had. The only question left was how much of the family believed them. After that phone call with Eric, I stopped wondering whether I was imagining things. The hesitation in his voice had answered more questions than his words ever could. For years, I had trusted that if someone misunderstood me, the people closest to me would correct it. That belief suddenly felt naive. Over the next several days, I found myself looking backward more than forward. Not because I enjoyed reliving old memories. Because I wanted to understand how long this had been happening. The answers were uncomfortable. One memory returned almost immediately. For years. Earlier, my niece held a baby shower. I arrived with gifts, flowers, and a handmade blanket I had spent weeks knitting. The moment I entered the room, conversations seemed to pause. At the time, I assumed I was interrupting something. Looking back, I remembered the way several women exchanged glances before smiling politely. Later that afternoon, I overheard someone say, "She seems different from what Monica described." At the time, the comment barely registered. Now it felt impossible to ignore. Then I remembered Christmas 2 years earlier. Eric and Monica hosted dinner. Throughout the evening, several relatives thanked Monica for being patient with me. Patient. The word confused me then. It confused me even more now. Nobody explained what I supposedly needed patience for. Monica simply smiled modestly and changed the subject. Another memory surfaced. A family barbecue. A cousin I had always been close to pulled me aside and gently suggested that I should not be so hard on Monica. I remember staring at him in complete confusion. Hard on her? We barely spoke outside family gatherings. Yet somehow, people believed I spent my time criticizing her. One by one, old moments returned. Tiny incidents. Brief conversations. Strange comments. Individually, none of them seemed significant. Together, they painted a very different picture. The version of Patricia Bennett being discussed behind closed doors was not me. She was demanding, judgmental, controlling, difficult. She existed only in stories. Yet those stories had somehow become stronger than reality. The realization hurt more than I expected. Not because strangers believed those things. Because family did. One afternoon, while organizing old photo albums, I found a picture taken shortly after George retired. We were standing on the porch, smiling into the camera. Looking at his face brought an unexpected wave of emotion. George always noticed things before I did. He paid attention to details, to patterns, to motives. Suddenly, I wondered whether he had seen any of this before he passed away. The thought stayed with me for the rest of the day. That evening, I opened a drawer in the den where I kept some of George's personal papers. Most of the contents were ordinary. Greeting cards, notes, old receipts. Then I found a small notebook tucked beneath a stack of documents. My pulse quickened immediately. George carried that notebook everywhere during his final years. He used it to record appointments, reminders, and observations. Curious, I opened it. Most pages contained harmless notes about daily life. Yard work, grocery lists, doctor appointments. Then I noticed something unusual. Several pages near the back contained names. Family names. Alongside them were brief handwritten comments. I slowly turned another page. Then another. The further I read, the more my heart began to race. Because for the first time, I realized I might not have been the only person who noticed something was wrong. For nearly an hour, I sat alone in George's den reading page after page of notes from the small notebook. Most entries were brief. A sentence here. An observation there. Nothing dramatic. Nothing emotional. That was exactly how George approached problems. He never rushed to conclusions. He paid attention first. Then he looked for patterns. The first note that caught my attention was dated almost 4 years earlier. Beside Monica's name, George had written, "Tells different versions of the same story depending on the audience." I stared at the sentence for several seconds. Then I turned the page. Another entry appeared 6 months later. Family gathering. Patricia absent. Monica discussed Patricia's attitude for nearly 20 minutes. My stomach tightened. George had noticed it, long before I ever did. The further I read, the clearer the picture became. Several notes described situations where relatives seemed to know personal details about me that I had never shared. Others mentioned Monica speaking on behalf of family members who were perfectly capable of speaking for themselves. One line stood out more than the others. People often leave conversations believing they formed their own opinions. Sometimes they did not. That sentence sounded exactly like George. Calm, observant, uncomfortably accurate. I continued reading until I reached the final pages. Those entries were different, more detailed, more focused. George described noticing a growing distance between me and certain relatives. At first, he assumed it was simply life. People become busy. Families drift apart. But eventually he began seeing the same pattern repeated too many times. Someone would become distant. A misunderstanding would appear. Then Monica would somehow already know about it. I leaned back in my chair and closed the notebook for a moment. Suddenly, dozens of old interactions looked different. The awkward conversations, the missing invitations, the relatives who seemed strangely cautious around me. It was as though someone had spent years quietly editing my reputation one conversation at a time. The following afternoon, my phone rang. The caller was my sister Carol. We had always been close, though not as close in recent years. After a few minutes of casual conversation, she hesitated. Then she said something unexpected. "Patricia, there is something I have been meaning to ask you." My heart immediately quickened. "What is it?" There was a brief pause. "Did you really tell Eric that Monica was not good enough for him?" I closed my eyes. Another accusation. Another story. "No," I replied quietly. "I never said that." Silence filled the line. Then Carol exhaled. "I thought so." The simple response told me everything. She had heard the story. She had believed enough of it to ask the question. Yet she also knew me well enough to doubt it. We spoke for nearly an hour afterward. By the time the conversation ended, I learned something important. Carol had heard several stories over the years. Stories about arguments that never happened. Criticisms I never made. Conflicts I never started. Somehow, Monica always seemed connected to the source. When the call ended, I sat quietly in the den. For the first time, I no longer felt confused. Hurt, yes. Disappointed, certainly. But not confused. Because the truth was finally beginning to take shape. Then I noticed something tucked inside the back cover of George's notebook. It was a folded piece of paper. On the front, written in his familiar handwriting, were 4 words that immediately made my pulse quicken. "If this gets worse." My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the piece of paper hidden inside the back cover of George's notebook. The paper had been folded so carefully that it was obvious he intended someone to find it eventually. More specifically, he intended me to find it. The note was short, only a few paragraphs. Yet every sentence seemed important. "Patricia," it began, "if you are reading this, then the pattern continued longer than I hoped it would." I immediately felt my throat tighten. George explained that during the final years of his life, he became increasingly concerned about how family members viewed me. Not because of anything I had done, because of what they believed I had done. He wrote that several relatives approached him privately over the years with concerns that made no sense. Stories, complaints, rumors. According to George, the details changed, but the source never seemed far away. Then came a sentence that stopped me completely. "The problem was never your behavior. The problem was the story being told about your behavior." I read the line 3 times. Suddenly, everything felt painfully clear. For years, I had been defending myself against consequences without ever knowing the accusations. George continued. He explained that he intentionally avoided direct confrontation because he wanted evidence, not assumptions. He believed that if someone was quietly manipulating relationships within the family, the truth would eventually expose itself. All it needed was time. Near the end of the note, George mentioned a name. Harold Simmons. I recognized it immediately. Harold had been our attorney for nearly 20 years. Beneath the name, George wrote a simple instruction. If things ever become impossible to ignore, talk to Harold. The following morning, I made the call. Harold answered personally. His voice sounded older than I remembered, but still steady. When I explained why I was calling, there was a brief silence. Then he said something that immediately caught my attention. "Your husband asked me to keep certain documents available if you ever contacted me." My pulse quickened. We arranged to meet that afternoon. Harold's office sat on the second floor of an old brick building downtown. The conference room overlooked the town square. For a few moments, we exchanged polite conversation before he opened a file resting on the table. "George was a careful man," he said. "He noticed things." I nodded. "I know." Harold removed several pages from the file. None of them were legal battles or dramatic revelations. Instead, they were records, notes, correspondence, observations. George had apparently documented multiple situations where family members repeated stories about me that could be traced back to the same source. Harold carefully explained that George never wanted conflict. He wanted clarity. He hoped he was wrong, Harold said quietly, but he prepared in case he was not. Then Harold showed me something unexpected. A letter George left specifically for a family meeting if circumstances ever reached a certain point. Family meeting. The phrase immediately caught my attention. Harold folded his hands. Your husband requested that this only be used if the situation became serious. I thought about Lily's comment, Nancy's questions, Carol's confusion, years of misunderstandings. Then I looked back at Harold. I think we are already there. He nodded slowly. Before I left, we agreed to schedule a gathering. Eric would be invited. Monica as well. As I drove home that evening, I felt strangely calm. For the first time, I was no longer chasing answers. The answers already existed. The only thing left was deciding who was willing to face them. The family meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday afternoon. During the days leading up to it, I noticed something curious. The more confident Monica became, the calmer I felt. It was not because I enjoyed what was happening. It was because confidence often makes people careless. Monica called twice during that week. Both conversations followed the same pattern. She sounded cheerful, friendly, almost relieved. The tension that had existed for years seemed completely absent from her voice. At one point, she even suggested organizing a larger family gathering later that summer. Listening to her, I found myself wondering whether she truly believed the story she had spent years telling. Perhaps she did. Perhaps after repeating something often enough, people begin convincing themselves it is true. Eric also called. Unlike Monica, he sounded nervous, distracted. More than once, he started a sentence and stopped midway through it. Something was bothering him. I could hear it in the pauses between his words. Yet whenever I asked if everything was all right, he immediately insisted that it was. The evening before the meeting, I sat alone in George's den once again. His notebook remained open on the desk beside me. Outside the window, the sun slowly disappeared behind the trees. The room felt familiar, safe. For years, George used this space to think through difficult situations. Now I understood why. Quiet makes patterns easier to see. Looking through the notebook one final time, I noticed a sentence I had somehow overlooked before. The loudest story is not always the truest one. I smiled sadly. That sounded exactly like George. Over the years, Monica had controlled the narrative because she was willing to tell it repeatedly. Meanwhile, I spent those same years assuming the truth would speak for itself. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it needs help. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I made coffee and carried a cup onto the back porch. George's empty chair remained beside mine. The roses he planted years ago were beginning to bloom again. Looking at them, I felt a surprising sense of peace. Whatever happened later that day, I no longer felt afraid of it. The meeting was not about revenge. It was about clarity. By noon, I was on my way to Harold's office. The conference room overlooked the same town square where George and I once attended holiday parades with Eric when he was little. Strange how life circles back on itself. When I arrived, Harold was already there organizing documents. A few minutes later, Eric and Monica entered together. Monica looked completely comfortable, confident, certain. Eric looked exhausted. The contrast between them was impossible to miss. We exchanged polite greetings and took our seats. Harold began with routine matters, estate records, administrative documents, general information. Monica listened attentively and occasionally nodded. Several times she exchanged brief glances with Eric. Then Harold reached for a separate folder. The atmosphere in the room changed immediately. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even Monica's smile faded slightly. Harold opened the folder and adjusted his glasses. Before we continue, he said, there are several documents George Bennett specifically requested that I review if certain concerns ever arose within the family. For the first time all afternoon, I saw uncertainty appear on Monica's face. And somehow, I knew the story everyone believed was about to meet the truth. Harold opened the folder slowly and removed several pages. The room remained completely silent. Even Monica seemed unsure whether to speak. For years, she had controlled conversations simply by being the first person willing to tell a story. Today, however, the story belonged to someone else. Harold adjusted his glasses and began reading from George's notes. The first entries were straightforward observations. Dates, family gatherings, conversations. Nothing dramatic. Yet as he continued, a pattern emerged. George had documented multiple situations where different relatives approached him with concerns about me. Concerns based on stories they had heard rather than experiences they actually had. Harold carefully reviewed several examples. In one case, a cousin believed I was refusing to support family events. In another, a relative believed I regularly criticized Monica behind her back. Neither accusation was true. More importantly, neither accusation came from direct experience. They came from conversations. Harold paused and looked around the room. Your husband became concerned when he noticed the same misunderstandings appearing repeatedly among people who had never witnessed the behavior themselves. Nobody spoke. Harold continued. George's notes showed that whenever confusion surfaced, the details often led back to the same source. Not always directly, not always obviously, but consistently enough to attract his attention. For the first time, I noticed Monica, shifting uncomfortably in her chair. The confidence she carried into the room was beginning to disappear. Then Harold reached a section of notes that George labeled patterns. The word immediately caught my attention. George described how stories often changed depending on the audience. One relative heard that I was controlling. Another heard I was selfish. A third heard I was emotionally manipulative. The accusations were different. The conclusion was always the same. Patricia Bennett was the problem. Harold folded one page and reached for another. There is also a personal statement, he said. My pulse quickened. George always expressed himself most clearly through writing. Harold began reading. George wrote that families are fragile. Trust is built slowly and damaged quietly. The most effective lies are rarely outrageous. They are small distortions repeated over time. Distortions that eventually feel familiar enough to become accepted as truth. The room felt smaller with every sentence. Then came the line that changed everything. The problem was never Patricia's behavior. The problem was the story being told about her behavior. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. The silence seemed to stretch across the room. Finally, Monica spoke. There must be some misunderstanding. Her voice sounded less confident than usual. Harold looked at her politely. George anticipated that possibility, which is why he documented specific examples over several years. Monica immediately fell silent again. Beside her, Eric stared at the table. He looked exhausted, as though pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place whether he wanted them to or not. Harold carefully placed the notes aside. Then he reached into the folder one final time and removed a sealed envelope. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. Across the front was George's unmistakable handwriting. My heart tightened immediately. Harold looked toward me before speaking. Your husband instructed me to read this only if the situation ever reached this point. Monica stared at the envelope. Eric looked confused. I felt a familiar ache in my chest. Even now, George was still trying to protect me. Harold carefully broke the seal and unfolded the pages. Then he looked up and spoke words that instantly changed the atmosphere in the room. This final letter is addressed to Patricia, Eric, and Monica together. Harold unfolded the final letter and began reading. The room became so quiet that I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner above us. The first sentence immediately sounded like George. If this letter is being read, then the truth has spent too long waiting for permission to speak. My throat tightened. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Harold continued. George wrote that during his lifetime, he learned many lessons about business, family, and trust. Yet one lesson remained more important than all the others. Reputations are fragile. A reputation can be damaged by 1,000 small suggestions long before a single accusation is ever made. He explained that most people do not believe lies because they are foolish. They believe lies because they hear them often enough to mistake familiarity for truth. Then came the section addressed directly to Eric. Son, if you are hearing this, I need you to remember something. Silence is not neutrality. Silence often becomes permission. Eric lowered his eyes immediately. Harold continued reading. George wrote that family relationships require protection, not only from enemies, but sometimes from stories. Stories that grow quietly over time until nobody remembers where they started. Every sentence seemed to land heavier than the one before it. Then George addressed Monica, not with anger, not with accusations, simply with honesty. He wrote that influence carries responsibility. Anyone capable of shaping how people view another person must use that influence carefully. Because once trust is damaged, repairing it can take years. The room remained completely silent. Monica stared down at the table. For the first time since I met her, she seemed unable to find the right words. Then Harold reached the final page. George's last message was addressed to me. Patricia has spent her entire life trying to keep peace within this family. If you ever find yourselves questioning her character, ask yourselves a simple question. Did you hear it from Patricia herself, or did you hear it from someone else? Tears filled my eyes immediately. Not because George was defending me, because he understood me. Even after all these years, he understood exactly what had happened. Harold finished reading and carefully folded the letter. The room remained silent. Nobody seemed eager to speak first. Eventually, Eric looked toward me. His expression was unlike anything I had seen before. Not anger, not confusion, regret. "Mom," he said quietly. I should have paid closer attention. I held his gaze for several seconds. Then I nodded. "You should have." The words were simple. They did not need to be anything else. Eric lowered his head. He understood. After a moment, I added one final sentence. "People told you who the problem was. You never asked whether they were telling the truth." Nobody disagreed. Monica remained silent. For years, she had controlled the narrative. Today, there was no narrative left to control. Only facts. Only consequences. A few minutes later, we stood and left the conference room. Outside, the afternoon sunlight reflected from the windows surrounding the town square. Life continued exactly as it always had. Cars passed through intersections. People carried shopping bags and coffee cups. Nothing looked different. Yet everything felt different. Several months later, I still live in the same house George and I shared for most of our marriage. His favorite chair remains beside the living room window. His photograph still sits on the bookshelf. Every morning, I drink coffee on the porch and watch the neighborhood wake up. I still miss him. I always will. But George left me something more valuable than protection. He left me perspective. He left me dignity. Most importantly, he left me the truth. For years, people believed I was the problem. They repeated it. They accepted it. They built opinions around it. Then the truth finally arrived. And when it did not need to shout. It simply stood in the room and let everyone see what had been there all along.